Okay. Well, Professor Francesca, how in your career did you start working with global history, and what defines it in your conception?
Okay, so thank you, first of all, for having me. I hope I will not disappoint you if I say that I do not consider myself a global historian. But it is true that in 2009, I published a book that I described as a global history on a small scale. The book was called Familiarity of Strangers, and it was a study of family business of Jewish traders who were based in a town called Livorno in Tuscany in Italy, but they traded throughout the Mediterranean and as far as Northern Europe and Portuguese India during the first half of the 18th century. And the global dimension of the study was dictated by the geographical reach of their trading networks. However, my interest had less to do with the actual geographical dimension of their operations, although I was very interested in the fact that these were considered peripheral in the early 18th centuries. It was not a particularly Atlantic-centered sets of routes. It was still, sort of a sets of connections that linked them to the Indian Ocean and to the Portuguese Empire, which had lost its primacy in the Indian Ocean. But really, my questions were dictated by a set of problems in economic history, namely how these small family firms built cooperation, both with other Jews, with family members, with other Jews, both in their inner circles and with other groups of Jews, and with non-Jews. So really the interest was dictated by academic and historiographical problems. So I came to global history by a set of problems, not by an interest in global history, but in order to answer those questions, in order to understand how this small firm was able to build cooperation at the local level and over very long distances with families of, for example, Hindu traders in India and Catholic traders in Lisbon. These are locations where there is, as you know very well, a very significant presence of an inquisition that would be very interested in seizing the goods of the Jewish traders and how they circumvented the Inquisition. I needed to understand their ways of operating both locally and globally. So I want to emphasize my interest had to do with a set of historical questions and historiographical approaches, rather than I didn't set out to say, oh, how can I do my version of global history?
Thank you. What are the possibilities for dialogue between local and global, between the micro and the macro?
Well, the possibilities are infinite. I hope, from what I just said, I perhaps gave you a little bit of flavor of what I've tried to do. And I was very fortunate when I was an undergraduate. My main teacher was Giovanni Levi, one of the main proponents of the Italian microstoria. So he's influenced me enormously, and so it comes very natural to me to think about the interconnection of the micro and the macro scales. And here it may be important to note that for Italian microhistorians of the 1980s and 1990s, although the majority of their written work, which is widely known and widely translated, concerns often one individual or one village or one episode, but their interest, and they've repeatedly reiterated it, was with the importance of the analytical variations of scales, of what emerges by looking at the same phenomena from different analytical level of analysis, from different scales. And that's certainly what I have attempted to do in the study that I just mentioned on the networks of Jewish traders in Livorno. So, there's a lot of studies of the Jews of one town or the Jews of one cities. And then there are some studies, fewer than one would imagine, of Jewish trading networks over certain long distances. In fact, what happens if you look at them simultaneously? That's important. So the interconnection of the micro and the macro, it's certainly one of the most important lessons of the Italian microhistory, which may differ from ways in which microhistory has been understood, particularly in other Anglo-American contexts. No less important, in my view, is the fact that this interconnection of micro and macro levels of analysis is essential to a number of very important historiographical traditions, regardless of the global history etiquette. I think, some of very important studies that have influenced all of us. Think, for example, of Norbert Elias' The Civilizing Process, written in 1939 in German. Sociological historical studies of European state building. So a topic of enormous importance from, foundational theme for academic research in the 19th century, and normally studied at the level of diplomacy, military history, the fiscal apparatus of the state. There are incredibly important pages in the Civilizing Process about the use of the fork or table manners, right? And there are beautiful opening pages about the micro and the macro. So, that's just one example about how thinkers, long before the trend of both microhistory and global history, have tried to link these levels of analysis that may seem to be, proceeding in parallel, in fact, have to inform each other. One classic, very important book in global history, Kenneth Pomerantz' The Great Divergence, published in 2000, the kind of book that every historian reads, regardless of their specific field of specialization, is an intervention on a very macro scale, why England industrialized and not other areas of the world. But each chapter, as you know well, actually builds on evidence that is rather micro. There's chapters about levels of consumption, about household consumption, demographic data, some wage data, that sort of rather microeconomic level of analysis. It doesn't use the kind of data that other economic historians use, such as GDP, to compare the level of economic development of China and England, as others have done. So there are others who have been influenced by very different traditions, who are trying to build very large, very large scale level of analysis, but building from the ground up and trying to link the micro and the macro. And I think these are intellectually some of the most stimulating kind of studies, although none of it is perfect, but in terms of intellectual stimulation, I find them extremely stimulating.
Okay. And talking about the temporalities, the different temporalities, how to work with the multiple temporalities of global history? Is there a short-term global history?
Well, there are books about, there's a book 1688 everywhere in the world. There are, but let me speak a little bit about the period I'm more familiar with, the early modern period, let's say 1500 to 1800. Obviously, the more modern and contemporary period, that's where it's somewhat different, because there's a predominance of the nation state on the one hand, and yet there's an international framework that also becomes more important. But the early modern period, I think it's an interesting time period to probe your question of temporalities, because on the one hand, from the 1960s, when serious thinking went into developing the notion of early modernity, and thinkers, historians such Joseph Fletcher argued that there was a sets of interconnections and parallelism between what was happening in Europe and in Asia that allowed for this definition, for this label, early modernity, to be used both in Europe and in Asia. And that was a way of walking away from more Eurocentric periodization. But there was also an argument about the early modern period as being a period when there was a kind of a quickening of the tempo, that the interconnections were becoming thicker and more rapid. On the other hand, scholars of pre-colonial societies, as well as scholars of post-colonial societies, have been very critical of this approach, reminding early modern historians reminding them of the violence that colonialism imposed by erasing or forcing new temporalities on pre-existing ones. And that's very true. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And at the same time, yet, and sort of a third point, is that within Europe itself, that's my own provincialism, the historiography and the history I know best, during the 16th century, there were multiple temporalities. So scholars of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, including a microhistorian such as Carlo Ginzburg, but not only him, even much more traditional historians, have amply demonstrated that a large segment of the population that was only partially literate knew very little about the dogma of Christianity, and actually lived with the temporalities that were largely pagan, with the rites that were linked to concepts of seasonality that had little to do with the liturgical calendar and much to do with ancient pagan rituals, Benandanti, made famous by Carlo Ginzburg, but others. So even within the most in the core of Europe, there was a process of violence, if you want to see it that way, by the church and by the elite to impose a learned ecclesiastical calendar and temporality. And as you can tell from all my comments, where I'm trying to go is that I think we want to be, I'm trying to de-emphasize purposely the novelty of global history. not to detract from its importance, and we can return to it. But I think now that global history has been around for a while as a slogan, as a label, as a genuine contribution, I think particularly for those of you who are young and are coming, after the more disruptive wave, if you wish, of this label, you want to think about what global history can do to break away from the more conventional ways of doing business that historians had, and what in fact had been done already under different guises and different etiquettes. Because I think it's upon those of you who are the younger generation, you just want to you want to do the leverage you have, obviously, but we also want to be mindful that there were ways in which historians were aware of some of the questions that we're now asking when we talk about global history that had been asked before and addressed. And it's not, questions are never answered once and for all. There's going to be always new books about class. There's always going to be new books about the American Revolution or the French Revolution or about 1947 in India. It's not that the classic topics are going to be closed, but we want to be sure we're not reinventing the wheel and we don't forget what was done before.
Yeah. And does each type of research object has the potential to become part of a global history?
Well, in light of what I said, I guess I'll just at least provocatively would say no, in the sense that yes, of course, we have many objects of studies that have benefited enormously for being looked at from a global history perspective. In my personal experience, I would say that if nothing else, global history has rejuvenated the curricula in the classroom, and that, there's so much national history that is being taught in every country, in every school. So there's a lot of, national history that can be revisited. So scholarly wise, obviously, yes. I mean, there's a lot of the examples will be endless. With a colleague here, my colleague Nicola Di Cosmo, we did a small roundtable earlier, just before the pandemic, last February, and one example he brought, he's a scholar of early China, and he's developing a hypothesis about the Manchu conquest of China, what later became the Qing dynasty, and is not displacing earlier interpretation that are all rooted in the inner Asia aspects of this phenomenon, but he thinks that the arrival of silver from the Americas had something to do with it. And so there's a potential global dimension that may have been overlooked, in the sense that China most likely, China did use the silver, in the traditional interpretation, China is sort of the sink where all this silver that came from Manila stay there. Instead, he finds that China used this silver to acquire goods and purchase protections and good from the Manchu. And then it's possible that this monetization and this commercialization empowered the Manchu, and this may have had reverberation. So it's possible, there's still a hypothesis, that really a turning point in world history may be revisited in light of a phenomenon that had truly global a global implication. In January, there's a new book coming out by Emma Rothschild called An Infinite History, which is a study of multiple generations of a family who lived in a small town in the heart of France, called Angoulême. And that's the heart of France that is supposed to be as provincial as it comes, just completely isolated, really la France profonde. And in fact, she documents the extraordinary range of connection that this town had in the 18th century with the French Caribbeans, with the sugar plantations, later with Algeria, and so even the most remote parts of rural France were not as isolated as they were thought. So there are plenty of examples of, object of study, as you say, that are coming to light anew because we're asking questions from a global perspective, let's call it that way, that we didn't. But then there are also enormously important object of studies that we ought to continue to study, even if they are not global. Just they are important, and there's in 2013, Peter Brown published this extraordinary book, in my view, Through the Eye of a Needle, which is the study of the first 200 years of the Western Church, when Christianity, the first 200 years of when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire and its changing attitudes toward money. And these are, extraordinary implications for the whole European Mediterranean region and for centuries to come. Neither he nor any of the reviewers I know of would call it a global history. That's not how it was conceived. It certainly is in a way, but it shouldn't be called that way, and it should be read and discussed as a very important book, regardless. I also want to mention a book that was just published very recently. I mean, there's so many we could talk about, but Caroline Walker Bynum put together a book of essays that I think would be of interest to many of you. It's called Dissimilar Similitudes. Play on a paradox, obviously. And it's a set, it's a set of reflections method. It's a study that she's been doing for several years, a number of studies of devotional objects and material culture in late medieval Europe. But it's really, it forces us to think about how do we conceptualize analogies and comparisons? Because, a lot of these, global history and connected history has emerged in part as a reaction to, or at least in tension with, comparative history. But there remains a lot of comparative aspects built into various versions of global history. And in a provocation that she and other art historians, I think, are putting before us is how many times are comparisons, or to put it more accurately, how many times are analogies that we, as scholars or observers, generate the result of our ignorance? We may see similitudes, we may see analogies because we don't know very much, and things may appear similar because we only scratched the surface. And so I think it's regardless of the specificity, even if you may be a scholar, of modern Latin American revolutions or the environment and comparing different form of environmental destructions in different parts of the world, regardless, I think it's a very important set she has a particularly insightful essay that was published autonomous. It's called The Tyranny of Morphology. It has as a book of essays works particularly well, but it's a way of thinking, how much of global history rests on us moving outside of our areas of specialization and moving into areas where, we read some secondary literature, we build some knowledge, and then we begin to see that we build some analogies and we build some knowledge and we see some comparisons, but maybe we see them because we don't have a very deep understanding. And so it goes back to the local and the global and the micro and the macro. How do we actually conjugate, the kind of deep knowledge that as historians or sometimes as humanists we pride ourselves in, together with the desire to make larger claims, larger generalization, and to move away from our very circumscribed little, gardens. But I think it is an important, dissimilar similitudes. It's an important book that make us think about, with a certain level of humility, but also, with a certain intensity, about how do we think about moving away from our areas of specialization, without thinking that it's so easy to do.
I want to read this book now.
Okay.
Very interesting. And well, now that basic question. In your opinion, what are the main risks and the main challenges in global history?
Well, as you can tell from my rambling, there certainly are many risks and many challenges. I do think that global history can be a good antidote to the predominance of national history and school curricula, as I said. Although I think that is a long challenge. But maybe we just to pick two, and I'm sure others will have other, just for the sake of suggesting some themes of discussion. To be slightly hyperbolic, I would say there's no such thing as global history, in the sense that it is a particularly amorphous label and definition. If you compare the rubric global history to many other rubrics that have erupted, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, when the historiography throughout, was, when academic historical writing was filled of movements that tried to regenerate itself. Of course, whether it was modernization theory or Marxism or the linguistic turn or the new social history or the new cultural history, each one, or feminism, each one was certainly divided in its ranks, and there was pluralism within it. But if you try to, say which are the books in global history that everybody has to read, I can think of one or two, but then I can also see the opposite. It's very, I find it peculiar that, that you can have Niall Ferguson, A Financial History of the World, possibly being, coming under the rubric of global history. And then you can have Professor Sanjay Subramaniam holding the chair of early modern global history at the Collège de France, when I cannot imagine any universe in which these two figures would come, under the same historiographical paradigm, right? So it's very rare as a phenomenon, and it's very early 20th century, perhaps, but it is rare. And in this sense, what do we do with that? And I think for those of you who are young, I would say, take stock of this anomaly. Don't think that global history is something and that you have to adapt to it. Try to articulate for yourself what global history does for you, if it does anything, and what kind of global history you may want to engage with or not. Is it useful at all, or which forms are useful? Because it does not come in a package, and there's not many prescriptions that come with it. It is a very liquid, it's this very liquid form, this is not, in the old days, even when I was in graduate school, there were books that you loved or you hated, and now when I used teach graduate students, they all like everything, and I'm like, no, you can't like both books. No, you like either one or the other. Just it's strange, right? So maybe let's start with thinking that global history, it's too capacious as a definition. And it doesn't help us to have such a capacious definition, or at least, what do we do with such a capacious definition? We are historians who do taxonomical work all the time. So maybe we want to take it apart, or maybe we want to decide that this is not going to work. Or what do we do with the fact that in the early 20th century, we're faced with the fact that the greatest attraction in the job market, in the publishing world, is a slogan that it's actually maybe a theme, maybe a perspective, but not a methodology. That seems to me something that we need to think about very hard. Another theme that I think you and I maybe want to bring up for conversation is the gender dimension. Recently, Pamela Crossley had a short blog in which she raised the issue of she mentioned that there seems to be more men than women writing big books that go under the rubric of global history. There are women writing that kind of bold reinterpretation. Not all big books are bold reinterpretations, though all present themselves as such. Some are, some are not. There are some women. Pamela Crossley herself was one of the earliest to write a book, What is Global History? My former colleague, Valerie Hansen, wrote a book called The Year 1000. But maybe there is a certain kind of macho element in wanting to write that kind of book. I personally am sort of more interested in writing for a different kind of audience, so I haven't ventured there. But for those of you who are young and for whom even the sort of binary, notion of gender seems to be very passé, maybe this is I don't know, but it still lives in the real world. So that may be a question: is gender history actually, is global history maybe tied up implicitly, or with certain with the backing of a certain publishing world to certain kind of gender structures of power that we weren't aware of? I haven't done any, but something to think about. Is it something in the global south that is as present as in the northern hemisphere as not? These are more hidden elements, but always worth pondering.
I never thought about that, but now hearing you say it is true. I mean, usually we already read more books and articles made by men, but in global history, yeah, that's true. I'm thinking if I ever read any books made by a woman in this area, and I don't think I have. That's interesting.
There may be a different preponderance, but yeah, I mean, there's a little blog, it's short, maybe you can circulate it with, among your colleagues, and you can discuss whether it resonates.
Yeah, that was great, really interesting. Thank you so much, Francesca, for participating.
Thank you, that was lovely, and look forward to hearing about the proceedings of your conference. And I think that you are, the future generation, so I want to hear what you guys think and not hearing what we think, because we are the past, you are the future.
I don't know. But thank you so much. This has been amazing.
Best of luck.
Okay. Well, I